What are the secret messages hiding in plain sight on the incredible tomb of Lady Margaret Douglas, Countess of Lennox, a woman who was the daughter of a Tudor princess and the grandmother of the King of Scotland and England? How does her grave reference her tumultuous and often tragic life? What is the dynastic story it tells that helped to propel her grandson to the English throne decades after her death? And what did the Stuarts and Victorians see when they peered into the vault? Lady Margaret Douglas was born on the 8th of October 1515 at Harbottle Castle in Northumberland. Her mother was Princess Margaret Tudor, Dowager Queen of Scotland, and her father was Margaret's second husband, Archibald Douglas, 4th Earl of Angus. She also boasted James V of Scotland as her big brother and Henry VIII of England as her uncle. It was quite the family tree, and it would only get more illustrious with time. This isn't a biography video, but you do need to know the broad strokes of her life to understand her tomb. Her parents' marriage was a disaster, and they ended up divorcing, with Margaret raised from the age of 3, first by her father, before being later placed in the household of her paternal aunt, Mary Tudor Brandon, Dowager Queen of France, then her first cousin, Princess Mary Tudor. She later served as a lady-in-waiting to Anne Boleyn, Anne of Cleves, and Catherine Howard. After a couple of ill-judged romantic liaisons, which earned her terms of imprisonment in the Tower of London, Sion Abbey and Kenning Hall in Norfolk, she was finally married off in 1544 to Scottish nobleman Matthew Stuart, 4th Earl of Lennox, in what turned out to be a great love match. By him, she had 8 children, though only 2 would survive to adulthood. These were Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, and Charles Stuart, later 5th Earl of Lennox. Margaret was a devout Catholic, and this led her to a huge falling out with Henry VIII, resulting in him cutting her and her children out of the English succession in his will. In fact, he cut all the descendants of his sister Queen Margaret out, not just her daughter. During Mary I's reign, however, she was restored to favour and even treated as the heiress presumptive over the future Eizabeth I, who was the legal heiress, but whom Margaret felt had the weaker claim on the crown due to her illegitimacy. After Elizabeth's accession in 1558, she plotted against the English Queen on occasion, again landing herself and her family in custody between 1561 and 1563. As you can tell, she was a political schemer and determined to further her family's interests and claims on both the crowns of Scotland and England as much as possible. Despite the dangers of persistently incurring Elizabeth's wrath, she helped to engineer the marriage of her elder surviving boy, Henry Lord Darnley, to his half-cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, in 1565, as the Scottish Queen's second husband. This led to Margaret being locked up again, but it was too late to undo the damage. Henry fathered a son with Mary, the future James VI of Scotland, and was then murdered in 1567 by an unknown person or persons. Lady Lennox's husband travelled to Scotland in 1561 to act as regent for their young grandson, who was by now James VI, after Mary Queen of Scots had been forced to abdicate and had ended up in custody in England. The plan was to bring the little King of Scotland south to England, but it never happened. Lennox was shot in the face outside Stirling Castle on the 4th of September 1571, leaving Margaret a widow. As for their younger son, Charles, he married Elizabeth Cavendish without royal permission, though both parties' mothers knew, leading to Lady Lennox being imprisoned, again, in the Tower of London. He fathered only one child, called Lady Arbella Stuart, born in 1575, then he died too in 1576. By then, Margaret had been freed and was living with this little family, and after her last child's death, she attempted to secure the Earldom of Lennox for Arbella. She failed, and finally, in poor health, died herself on the 9th or 10th of March 1578. I've seen different dates in different sources. She was interred in the chapel of Henry VII in Westminster Abbey. The Abbey's website gives the following short summary of how the service was conducted. In the Abbey archives, an order for her funeral shows that the coffin was to be met at the west door by the ministers and choir, and during the procession to the hearse, "I am the resurrection and the life" was to be said or sung. 2 or 3 psalms are suggested, and after the sermon there was the commemoration at the communion table with the epistle and gospel being read. At the offering, some parts of scripture were to be sung. The service then proceeded according to the prayer book. Now we come to her grave and its spectacular tomb. It lies in the south aisle of the chapel, and by the time Margaret was laid to rest, this section of the chapel already contained the remains and tomb of her great-grandmother, Lady Margaret Beaufort. The very grand tomb of Lady Lennox's niece/daughter-in-law, Mary Queen of Scots, was not there yet though, as Mary remained alive until 1587 and her remains wouldn't be moved to the Abbey until 1612, so the aisle will have been a lot more spacious than it is today. I'll leave my videos on those other 2 women's deaths and tombs linked below for you, by the way. In a sea of grey stone and white marble, Lady Lennox's tomb is remarkable for how colourful it is. It is a rectangular chest tomb made of alabaster. The corpse is actually in a vault underneath it, but more on that later, and measures 2.52 metres long, 1.36 metres wide, and 2.2 metres high. Atop it is a reclining figure showing Margaret with her head on an ornate tasselled pillow, hands clasped in prayer and wearing her robes of state, a red cloak with a fur collar and lining fastened at the neck, with a white cap trimmed in gold thread and a golden coronet on her head. She also wears a white Elizabethan ruff around her neck, likewise trimmed in gold and situated just above a blue and gold collar depicting quatrefoils within lozenges, which is part of the dress underneath. We can see more of this dress on her torso as the cloak is open to show it. The blue and gold fabric, in inverted commas, appears again on her sleeves, which also have little ruffs at the wrists. The outfit screams expensive and royalty. Her eyes are open, presumably staring up to heaven. She has a stern look upon her face, and at her feet sits a golden lion which used to have a crown on it that you can see in old images. There are also pointed obelisks at the corners of the tomb. Now, her own crown is one of the more remarkable additions to the tomb. Margaret was not a princess or a queen, but her mother was, and many of her relations were monarchs or consorts. As a result, Lady Lennox had strong links to both the English and Scottish thrones, and the crown on her head is there to remind you of that, and of the fact that this woman had a claim on the Tudor throne, even if it was never realised. This was particularly important at the time of her death, as in the 1570s, the other people with the best blood claims on the English throne were Margaret's daughter-in-law/niece, Mary Queen of Scots, and Lady Lennox's 2 grandchildren, Mary's son James VI of Scotland and Lady Arbella Stuart. They did not have the best legal claims, as Henry VIII's will specifically left them all out. The tomb was therefore a dynastic tool designed to remind those who saw it in the years after her death, when the succession was still very murky, that the Stuart family had the best claim to Elizabeth's throne, and to bolster that claim. Just as she had tirelessly promoted her family's interests in life, so Margaret continued to do so in death. That's just the top of the tomb, though. The ornate decoration continued on every side of it, and like her crown and outfit, everything is designed to showcase Margaret's family, rank, and/or her connections and even claims to the thrones of Scotland and England. To the Countess's left are 4 kneeling female figures on red cushions, with their hands raised in prayer to match hers. These are her lost daughters, all aged up to well beyond the years they actually attained, and none of whom are buried with her. But here they are, back with their mother in death, praying to God for her, and demonstrating that she was actually incredibly fertile, yet cursed by the horrifically high infant mortality rates of the 16th century. Look carefully and you'll see that they are also of different sizes to denote older to younger. They are all facing towards her feet, wearing black dresses with red bodices, their hair in a classic Elizabethan style with tight curls around the face, a high ruff at the neck, and a black and gold coif or cap on the back of the head. Like Margaret, they have white ruffs at their wrists too. In the middle of these girls is a shield depicting the Lennox coat of arms impaling those of Angus and Douglas, showing the marriage of Lady Margaret Douglas, daughter of the Earl of Angus, to the Earl of Lennox. On the other side of the tomb are 4 more little statues kneeling in prayer on red cushions with gold tassels. These depict Margaret's 4 lost sons. Like their sisters, they face their mother's feet, and we can tell which one is Lord Darnley as a crown hovers above his head, showing that he was King of Scotland. Presumably the figure directly next to him is Charles, the only other brother to reach adulthood, while the 2 smaller ones on the left beneath Margaret's head are the 2 who died as infants, though here they are depicted at a much older age than they reached, just as their sisters are. Her eldest died less than a year after his birth, for instance. Darnley is the largest statue, despite the fact that he was actually the second born, but as the father of James VI of Scotland, he is the most important dynastically speaking, and the tomb is designed to show that. As well as the crown, this is achieved through his outfit. While the smaller boys wear black robes edged with gold, Darnley and Charles wear black and gold armour, the clothing of adults, and most importantly of all, Darnley has a red cloak, making him the most visually distinctive of all the 8 siblings and echoing what his mother's statue on top of the tomb also wears. He is staring directly at the tomb of his wife, Mary Queen of Scots, which is a nice little irony as she was suspected of playing a role in his death, and of course his body is not in Westminster Abbey to lie near her. As I said earlier though, her tomb wouldn't have been there at the time Margaret was interred. Like the girls, the boys are divided into pairs with a shield in between them, showing the Lennox coat of arms impaling those of Angus and Douglas. It is these coats of arms, as well as Margaret and Darnley's cloaks and the gold detailing on the statue's clothes, which make the tomb so much more colourful than many of the others you can see in the Abbey. The coats of arms in between the children's statues are not the only ones present either. On the tomb's east end, we see Darnley's arms impaling those of Scotland, to represent his marriage to Queen Mary. On the west is a lozenge showing Angus and Douglas, the title and surname of Margaret's father, and of course her own maiden name. Let's not forget either the many inscriptions all around the tomb, which say relatively little of Margaret's own life, personality or accomplishments, and instead are mainly focused on who she was related to. Starting with the panel at her feet, then moving to those beneath her daughters, then her sons, we read the following, written in English, presumably to maximise the number of people who could absorb the information. Here lieth the noble Lady Margaret, Countess of Lennox, daughter and sole heir of Archibald, Earl of Lennox, by Margaret Queen of Scots his wife, that was eldest daughter to King Henry VII, who bare unto Matthew Earl of Lennox her husband 4 sons and 4 daughters. This lady had to her great-grandfather King Edward IV, to her grandfather King Henry VII, to her uncle King Henry VIII, to her cousin Germain King Edward VI, to her brother King James of Scotland V, to her son King Henry I, meaning Lord Darnley, who was declared King of Scotland, to her grandchild King James VI, having to her great-grandmother and grandmother 2 queens both named Eizabeth, this means Elizabeth of York and Elizabeth Woodville, to her mother Margaret Queen of Scots, to her aunt Mary the French Queen, to her cousins Germains, Mary and Elizabeth, Queens of England, to her niece and daughter-in-law Mary Queen of Scots. Gotta love this little bit of royal incest. Henry, second son to this lady, was King of Scots and father to James VI, now King. This Henry was murdered at the age of 21 years. Charles, her youngest son, was Earl of Lennox, father to the Lady Arbelle. He died at the age of 21 years and is here entombed. Yes, that's right, Lady Margaret is not alone in this tomb. One of her 8 children, Charles, Earl of Lennox, was moved to be with her. We'll come back to that in a few minutes though. By the way, if you're of Irish descent and not fortunate enough to have a famous ancestor like Margaret, whose tomb lays out 6 generations of your family tree for you without you having to lift a finger, you may like to buy my book, Find Your Irish Ancestors Online, which will help you to trace your lineage from the comfort of your own home. It's available on Amazon as an ebook and paperback and is linked in the description box and pinned comment for you. If you do buy, I'd be very grateful if you'd leave it a review, as this is super helpful for other buyers and for the Amazon algorithm, but it's something that hardly anyone does. At the head of the tomb, which is its west end, and on a plaque under her 2 sons who died as infants, are 2 other panels which are in Latin and which actually repeat a lot of information already given on the English panels. It is only here, though, in the text which would have been less accessible to the general public given the language it's written in, that we find out anything about Margaret herself or when she died. It translates to "Sacred to the memory of Margaret Douglas, wife of Matthew Stuart, Earl of Lennox, granddaughter to Henry VII, King of England, by his daughter, Margaret Tudor, joined by the closest ties of kinship to most puissant kings, grandmother to James VI of Scotland, a lady of most pious character, invincible spirit, and matchless steadfastness. She died the 10th of March, year of our Lord, 1577. This is in the Julian calendar, which took the new year as the 24th of March. She died in 1578, according to the modern Gregorian calendar. Margaret, mighty in virtue, mightier yet in lineage, ennobled by kings and by her forebears, descended from Scottish and English princes, she was also a progenitor of princes. Those things that belong unto death she released to death most joyfully, and sought God, for she belonged to God before. We do not know who the sculptor of this monument was, but we do know that it was erected very quickly after Margaret's death, as it used to include an inscription before a 1960s restoration, which read, "This work was completed at the charge of Thomas Fowler, the executor of this lady, 24th of October, 1578. Now this shouldn't come as any great surprise, as in her last will and testament, made less than a fortnight before her death, Margaret had specifically requested that she be buried in the Abbey and, despite her financial difficulties at the time of her demise, explained how her funeral was to be funded. She said, "My body to be buried in the great church of Westminster, in the monument, sepulchre, or tomb already bargained for and appointed to be made and set up in the said church. Also I will that the body of my son Charles shall be removed from the church of Hackney and laid with mine, both in one vault or tomb in the said church of Westminster. And I give, appoint, and bequeath for my burial and funerals to be bestowed and employed thereupon the sum of £1,200, alias £1,200, of lawful money of England, to be made and furnished of my plate, household stuff, and movables to be sold therefore." So the Countess wanted some of her household goods sold off to pay for a fitting send-off for her, and that is presumably what her servant and executor Thomas Fowler did. She seems to have prepaid for a monument. I wonder if it was even already in production at the time of her death, and this might well explain why it was in place just 7.5 months after her demise. However, this quick turnaround for the tomb is contradicted to some extent by what you will see written in some histories of the Abbey which discuss it. Arthur Penrhyn Stanley, writing in the late 19th century in his book Historical Memorials of Westminster Abbey, says in a footnote that "it may be observed that the monument must have been erected upon the accession of James to the English throne, as he is called in the epitaph on the tomb King James VI." Now this comment had me scratching my head. Surely the details of Margaret's will, the inscription mentioning Fowler and giving a date of 1578, and the fact that James was referred to only by his Scottish title indicates that the tomb predates his accession to the English throne in 1603. It is true that at one point an inscription says that Lord Darnley was father to James VI, now king, but to my eye that clearly means now King of Scotland. Nevertheless, you can find the assertion that James had the tomb built in other later works too. Helen Marshall Pratt, for instance, writing in 1914, said that her tomb had been in part arranged for by her will, but her grateful grandson, when he became King of England, not only erected a noble tomb in this isle to his mother, the Queen of Scots, and one of equal splendour to his predecessor Eizabeth, but probably, so she's not sure actually, built a large part of this to his grandmother. Like Stanley before her, Pratt cites no source for any information about James's involvement, and this might explain her uncertainty about his contribution to the tomb. But the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography expresses no such doubts, saying that a quarter of a century later, meaning 25 years after Margaret's death, which would be in 1603 when James succeeded to the English throne, her grandson James VI and First erected a fine monument in her memory. Now, as I've said, on the basis of the now lost 1578 inscription and the fact that James is referred to as King of Scotland on the tomb and not as the King of England as well, I suspect this information to be at least somewhat incorrect. Had he had this tomb made or very significantly altered, he certainly would have mentioned his other crown, and he likely would not have made anything of the fact that his uncle, Charles Stuart, was the father of Lady Arbella Stuart, a cousin whose claims to the throne he was keen to play down. See my video all about her tragic life to learn more. It's linked on screen and below. My hunch here is that first Stanley, then Pratt, got confused because, as Pratt correctly notes, James did have his mother's tomb built, which is right next to that of Margaret, dwarfing it, as well as the only marginally less impressive tomb under which Eizabeth I and Mary I lie on the opposite side of the chapel. Other authors have then followed their lead. Perhaps I'm wrong, but I'd want to see some primary sources from James I's reign to convince me that he was involved with this tomb and explain away the mention of Fowler. If James did do anything to it, and he may have done, then I suspect it was more of a glow-up rather than building the thing from scratch. I also think the design of this tomb screams Margaret, not James. The Lennoxes were very good at creating objects which proclaimed their dynastic importance and were full of hidden messages that are often lost on a modern audience. For example, they had an incredible mourning painting commissioned after Darnley's death, showing his parents, brother and son grieving around his dead body. They also had the famous Darnley or Lennox jewel created, it goes by both names, which I already have a video on, and which is not just an exquisite piece of jewellery, but also a statement about the family's position, power and dynastic hopes. I don't want to give too much away about it, but I'll link the video below for you. My point is, Margaret had a real flair for this kind of thing, and while James certainly signed off on the grand tombs for his mother and Queen Elizabeth, and they are huge, very impressive and full of messages of their own, I think, and this is just my interpretation of it, that Lady Lennox's tomb seems like something she would have designed, especially with the call-outs to her long-dead infant children, people whom King James surely cared little, if at all, about. Now, as I've mentioned, this tomb was restored in the 1960s, resulting in the loss of the 1578 inscription telling us when it was created. But what else was altered, and what is original to the memorial versus a 20th century edition? Well, if we look at a description from 1812 in William Combes' book on Westminster Abbey, we find that the 1578 inscription was certainly present at that point, as too were crowns over Margaret and Darnley's heads, which can also be seen in an image published in 1677. The book this image is published in also quotes the Fowler inscription, by the way, and although it doesn't show the inscriptions on the plaques beneath the statues of Margaret's sons, it quotes them in the main text and specifies where they are. In 1818, though, Edward Brayley, John Neal and Sidney Fisher wrote that the crown on Margaret's head was then broken, and that over Darnley's head was missing entirely, having, quote, been destroyed or stolen. It is therefore safe to say then that the coronets we see today are not original to the tomb, or in the case of Margaret's have at the very least been mended. An old photograph of the tomb, published in 1902, also shows that Darnley's crown was then missing, though in 1909 Francis Bond said that there remained the fastening of a crown. Brayley et al. Noted too that the hands on Margaret's effigy were broken, but they don't say how badly. We can see the damage in old images though, as well as severe damage to the obelisks, which look like they'd been cut in half by 1818. These authors noted too that there used to be railings around the tomb, which were gone even by that same year, but they knew what they had looked like, saying that on the iron railing which formerly surrounded this tomb were small badges and armorial standards. Westminster Abbey's website also mentions these railings, saying that they are now thought to be at a school at Piddle-Trent-Hyde in Dorset. We're going to finish with a look inside this tomb and at who else is in there with Margaret, because she's not alone. Just before I reveal all, however, if you've been enjoying this video, please give it a like, hype and comment, and subscribe with notifications on to keep up with all my new releases. It's all totally free and helps to show YouTube that my content is worth promoting. You can also join as a channel member for members-only posts and badges next to your name in the comments, or find me on patreon.com/historycalling, where I release bonus material every week, including early access to ad-free videos and patron-only podcasts. Also, we have a very lovely, friendly little community over there of like-minded history lovers, which you might enjoy being a part of. For some freebies, sign up to my mailing list on my website, historycallingofficial.com, to get 2 complimentary downloads right away, plus my newsletter. Do check the welcome email you'll get upon sign-up doesn't go to junk mail, and if it does, just assign messages from that email account as not spam, or add the email address to your contacts list so that the newsletter doesn't get dumped in the trash as well. As we know, Margaret rests with her son Charles, who died 2 years before her and was obviously moved to lie with her, just as her will had requested. I don't know when the move occurred, but the fact that he is mentioned in the inscription on the tomb as being there would suggest that it was done very quickly after her death, if we accept that the tomb was built, or mostly built, in 1578, as Fowler asserted. Both are in leaden coffins, and in around 1682, during the reign of Charles II, the vault was breached, if not opened entirely, for we have this account of its contents from Henry Keep in his Monumenta Westmonasteriensia. There is a small vault adjoining to this, wherein are only 2 coffins of lead, the one on the other, the undermost of which is very much shaken and decayed, so that the skeleton and meaning parched skin of the interred is to be seen, being the remains of Charles Earl of Lennox, youngest son to Matthew Earl of Lennox, and the Lady Margaret, his countess, grandfather and grandmother to King James. He died anno 1576. In the other capsula, or chest of lead, is the body of the aforementioned Margaret, mother to Charles Earl of Lennox and grandmother to King James. Now, Keep clearly says that there were only 2 people in the vault at that time, and we may imagine that Charles's coffin was damaged either when he was moved from his initial burial location to lie with his mother, or over time from having the weight of her coffin on his, because he was the undermost. If we jump forward to the 1860s, though, when Arthur Penrhyn Stanley was searching for the remains of Margaret's grandson, James VI and I, we get another peek inside the tomb and at a third person who was by then in it. By the way, you can also watch my video all about how James's corpse ended up being lost for centuries after his nasty death and burial, and where Stanley eventually found the body. It's linked on screen and below. Now, Stanley was hunting all over Westminster Abbey for James, and before he got to the Lennox vault, he tried Mary Queen of Scots first, thinking that perhaps mother and son had been reunited in death. When that proved fruitless, he moved on to the tomb next door, and he described what he discovered as follows. This vault, meaning Mary Queen of Scots' vault, opened on the west into a much narrower vault under the monument of Lady Margaret Lennox, through a wall of nearly 3 feet in thickness by a hole which is made about 3 feet above the floor and about 2 feet square. A pile of 3 or 4 of the small chests of James II's children obstructed the entrance, but within the vault there appeared to be 3 coffins, one above the other. The 2 lower would doubtless be those of the Countess and her son, Charles Earl of Lennox, the father of Arabella Stuart. Some people call her Arabella, but her name seems to have been Arbella or Arbel. The upper coffin was that of Esme Stuart, Duke of Richmond, whose name with the date 1624 was just traceable on the decay plate. On the south side of this vault there was seen to have been an opening cut and afterwards filled up with brickwork. This probably was the hole through which, before 1683, in Keep's time, the skeleton and dry shriveled skin of Charles Lennox in his shaken and decayed coffin was visible. It is remarkable that the position of the vault is not conformable with the tomb above, the head of the vault being askew 2 or 3 feet to the south. This is evidently done to effect a descent at the head, which could not otherwise have been made, because the foundation of the detached pier at the west end of the chapel would have barred that entrance, and no doubt if the pavement were opened beyond the inclined vault, the proper access would be discovered. So at some point from 1624 on, Esme Stuart, who was actually the 3rd Duke of Lennox, was also interred in the tomb, but when exactly is unclear. Esme, and yes, he was a guy despite the fact that we associate that name with girls, was a grandnephew of Margaret's by marriage, being the son of another Esme Stuart, 1st Duke of Lennox, who was in turn the son of Margaret's brother-in-law, John Stuart. Honestly, don't worry about keeping up with all of that. What matters is that he was a distant relative from a cadet branch of the Scottish Stuarts. He was obviously in the vault by Stanley's time, yet Keep doesn't mention him. Now, it seems incredible that Keep could have missed him, and yet Stanley was able to clearly see him about 180 years later, saying that the coffins were stacked 3 high, and yet I really can't explain what happened here. Esme was certainly buried in Westminster Abbey after his death of the spotted fever in August 1624, but was he buried elsewhere and moved to the Lennox vault at some point in or after 1682? Or was his coffin next to Margaret and Charles's in 1682 and somehow missed in the gloom when the vault was inspected in that year, then later stacked on top of the mother and son, perhaps when space was being sought to bury other Stuarts who ended up being put in Mary Queen of Scots' tomb instead? There are a lot of people in there with her. Or were all three coffins stacked up in 1682 and Keep didn't realise this? All are possible, and I will say that as mad as it seems to say that Keep couldn't count to 3, he actually made some incredible other mistakes regarding Margaret's tomb elsewhere in his book, when he said that the little statues around the sides of it showed 6 men and only 2 women, when they clearly show 4 of each, so he is arguably not the best source of information. As for the little coffins of James II's children, I don't think they're in the Lennox tomb, but rather in the Mary Queen of Scots vault. Again, this goes back to another video I did on where royal children were buried, which looks at that vault's contents in detail. The way Stanley describes it here, I also think he just means that their coffins were blocking the entrance into the Lennox vault from the Mary vault, rather than actually being in with Margaret, Charles and Esme. Also, there is a plaque on the floor listing who is in that vault, and it only has 3 names on it. As far as I can tell, these 3, Margaret, Charles and Esme, Duke of Lennox, have not been bothered since Arthur Penrhyn Stanley's day, and whatever is left of them is still down there in the Lennox vault, with Margaret mouldering away close to so many of her illustrious family members. I hope you enjoyed that study of her tomb and of what it tells us about her place in the Tudor and Stuart dynasties and her own opinion of her importance therein. Before I go, a quick thank you to everyone who supports the channel using the thanks button under videos. As always, your generosity is much appreciated and helps me to keep doing what I'm doing. Let me know below which feature of the tomb you find most interesting, and to learn more about the bodies buried in the Henry VII chapel, because there are a lot of them, make sure to check out one of these videos next, or watch my episode all about the incredible Darnley-Lennox duel. Until next time all, keep learning.